I'm gonna start with a gravestone. This is Brillat-Savarin's gravestone in a famous cemetery in Paris. And a number of years ago, he originally coined the phrase, "Tell me what you eat and I'll tell you who you are." He published the book, The Physiology of Taste. And in many ways, that represents why we're all here this evening, that there's some sense that if you can only understand human diet, it's an important part of our being as human beings. And somehow, if you can understand what our diet has been in the past, you can understand where we've come from and perhaps where we're going. Perhaps it's not a coincidence that I start with a gravestone, because so many of the things I'm going to be talking to you about this evening come from dead people or dead proto-people, and so it's somewhat appropriate. And our diets today are so different than diets in the past. I mean, in many ways, if you think back through time, I like to think incrementally. If you go back 5 years or 50 years or 500 years, 5,000 and on back to 50 million years ago, our diets, the further deeper you go into the past, the more fundamentally different our diets were. And in the last 50 years, I think you could argue that our diets have been shaped in large part by the food industry. But during this time period, and also before that for a number of years, humans made a living by farming, often just farming for their own subsistence. Now we do agribusiness, but that's a fairly recent trend. Before that, people foraged for wild foods, and people who looked and acted just like us, who had a variety of languages, figured out how to make a living off of foods in many different parts of the world that they didn't grow. They harvested wild foods, both plants and animals. Before that, there was a long phase of human evolution when we were living off of wild foods, but most people would call us proto-humans. We were not truly humans as we know today, and in fact, we've descended from a long, deep primate stock. What I'm going to focus on this evening is just the proto-human phase. There's so much to talk about in terms of human diet. I had to, and as you'll see, I have way too much to say this evening, and so I'm just going to focus a little bit and give you some examples from this proto-human phase. And I think it's also appropriate in this year in particular, as we celebrate the bicentennial of Darwin's birth, to remember the fact that Darwin predicted that, without fossils, mind you, when he was writing his Origin of the Species and doing all his research, he predicted that humans came from Africa. And certainly this evening I'm going to be telling you a lot about the sort of many of the discoveries over the last certainly century, the important fossils that have been found in Africa. And indeed, we are all Africans. We have very deep African roots. And Darwin, I think, would be pleased to know all the fossil discoveries that we found in the years since he was writing. And if you stretch back through time, we now know from both genetic evidence and we're getting better and better fossil evidence every day that we last shared a common ancestor deep in the past, probably over 7 million years ago, with the African apes. The apes have evolved since we shared a common ancestor, and so have we. And even though we're the last surviving representative of the human family, our current species, there have been times in the past when the human family has been incredibly diverse. And what we're going to talk about this evening is the extent to which we can, in a sense, trace the roots of our humanity in the diet from these ancient times, and trace our survival as a species to some of the sort of fundamental dietary traits that we had. I wanted to give you a brief romp through the fossil record to show you how much we've learned in the last few years. And really the first fossil from Africa that put humans on the evolutionary map, if you will, was this the little Tong fossil discovered and described by Raymond Dart back in the 1920s. He called it Australopithecus africanus, and he was very impressed with this little guy. He was convinced that because of the placement of its foramen magnum, that it was an upright biped. We have Dean Falk in the audience this evening has studied this particular fossil in great detail. So if you have any questions about Tong, you can ask Dean. But Dart described this in the 1920s, and it was controversial at the time. But he became convinced and made an argument in subsequent years, which was later popularized by Robert Ardrey in his book African Genesis, that this little young individual fossil was a representative of a species that not only was upright, but it must have been upright to use tools. And if it was an upright tool user, surely it must have been using tools to hunt and to kill. And in some ways, Dart was influenced in his later years by the fact that he was interpreting these fossils in the middle of right between and during the World Wars. And as the Leakey video before this talk started illustrated, humans have been known in time to be incredibly violent. And so in some ways, Dart was looking for clues to human nature. And he thought, well, perhaps we are descended from killer apes. And so he was convinced that this little Australopithecine was in fact a meat eater, and that we inherited that trait from this ancient time period. Subsequently, colleagues, in particular Robert Broom in South Africa, made a number of landmark discoveries that not only bolstered the sort of existence of the species Dart had originally described, Australopithecus africanus, but also found some other creatures. So you have adults of Africanus in the bottom left, famous skull that's been memorialized on stamps, sort of attained legendary status in South Africa, and also slightly different looking ones, skulls that were about the same size but had much thicker bones and larger chewing muscles and bigger teeth, it turns out. And a young man named John Robinson started looking at these sort of nose to nose, and they were found in these fossils and a number of others were found in cave deposits in South Africa. And they were originally understood to be two different kinds of proto-human from living in the same time period. And he looked at them. They were both bipeds, and yet they had different muscular attachment areas and very different teeth. And he became convinced that, in fact, what distinguished these two kinds of species was, in fact, their diet. That the little guy on the left had smaller chewing muscles and slightly smaller teeth and fit right into Dart's notion of being an omnivore. And the larger sort of individual on the right had larger teeth and larger chewing muscles. And Robinson became convinced that, in fact, it wasn't built for carnivory, that it was built for chewing plant foods. And so Robinson declared, in effect, invented what he called the dietary hypothesis, that there were these two types of creatures that shared the same landscape, and they were separated. Their niches were different due to dietary reasons. And here you can sort of see quick little sketches to show you on the left, show you some of the chewing muscles. And one of the things, we'll be looking at a few pictures of skulls this evening. One of the things you can do with skulls is reconstruct the placement of the different chewing muscles, the masseter and the temporal muscle. And you all can, if you've got some gum or something in your mouth, you can chew yourselves and try and feel how far up the side of your own skulls your own temporal muscles go. And while these Australopithecines had temporal muscles that went all the way to the top of their head, and for the robust one on the right, actually their muscles were so large they had to grow a bony crest to hold the size of the muscle on the top of the head. The human temporal muscles are much smaller. So maybe this evening in the privacy of your own home, you can see where your own temporal muscles go. The hitch with the dietary hypothesis, or one hitch, was that it turned out that these two species, what was interpreted as a generalized omnivore and more of a specialized vegetarian, in fact, were not sympatric. The smaller generalized omnivores interpreted lived a little bit earlier in time. We now understand that. So this was probably an evolutionary trend going from a more generalized creature to a more specialized creature. So that was the dietary hypothesis. And at that point, up until the end of the 1950s, all the knowledge we had about fossil proto-humans in Africa came from South Africa. But then, due to the pioneering work of the Leakeys that was mentioned earlier, over 30 years prospecting in Olduvai Gorge, finding lots and lots of stone tools, finally, in 1959, Lewis and Mary Leakey discovered the famous Zinjanthropus cranium. And initially, they were convinced this was the first proto-human from Africa, and I understand this as well. If you think about it, 1959, this is the 50th anniversary, and the Leakey Foundation is going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of Zinja's discovery later this summer. And so this remarkable discovery put East Africa on the map. And if you look at the teeth of Zinj, you'll see that he's got very small front teeth and little tiny canines and just whopping huge cheek teeth that have been ground really flat. And they look like they've been chewing and crushing and grinding something. Nobody was quite sure what. And the Leakeys originally dubbed this character Nutcracker Man because they thought the teeth were so impressive. He surely must have been chewing something. And initially they were convinced that he was a tool maker as well because he was found associated with all these stone tools in Olduvai Gorge. But then very, very quickly they found some other fossil proto-humans, and in particular this little creature here, a little jaw. And you can sort of see the difference in size between the teeth. That this little guy had much smaller teeth, and they found some other small bits and pieces of cranial remain, and Louis Leakey was convinced that this creature not only had smaller teeth, but it looked like it might have had a larger brain than Zinjanthropus, and so he decided that in fact, just like South Africa, East Africa had two different species, and this was a larger brained species with smaller teeth, was probably Homo, was probably our ancestor, and was probably an omnivore. That Homo habilis fit this dietary hypothesis model that had been developed. Homo habilis, an omnivore on one side, and at Olduvai Gorge, the big Zinj cranium then was the vegetarian. So this nice, neat parsing of these two guys. And Zinj is now referred to as either Australopithecus boisei or Paranthropus boisei. So he's a big character there. We'll see more of him. Fortunately for Lewis and Mary, their son Richard got very interested in human evolution and started prospecting in his own area in association with Glenn Isaac and a number of other scientists up in northern Kenya. And Richard found a number of incredibly well-preserved fossils up in northern Kenya that documented for once and for all that there were two sympatric different kinds of proto-human, two fundamental branches on our family tree in East Africa. And not only that, but the preservation of the cranium was so good that they were absolutely convincing that this early Homo creature had a bigger brain as well as smaller teeth. And so a real distinction from these Australopithecines that were found sharing the same landscape. So that's where things stood, and it all seems so nice and simple. You had early omnivores, and you had vegetarians. You had them in South Africa. You had them in East Africa, and then just a few years after Homo habilis was found, they found an even larger brained member of the Homo genus, Homo erectus. It was called, or sometimes it's been called. The early specimens are called Homo ergaster. Again, sort of sharing many of the same features. You've got these big Australopithecines on the right with massive chewing muscles and big, thick cheekbones to withstand stresses from the chewing muscles. And on the left, you have two different kinds of Homo with smaller chewing muscles, much more delicate bones and teeth and whatnot. So, and if you look at the jaws, the jaws of Erectus and Homo on the left are much more delicate. The teeth are a lot smaller, particularly the cheek teeth compared to Boisei. So there was no question, based on the morphology, that these were fundamentally different kinds of diets these guys must have been sort of living on. So I like to think of this as dietary hypothesis redux. It's we've come around again, and everything made sense. to the point where Alan Walker famously referred to these two creatures. He called the Australopithecines chewing machines because they were built to chew. They had this incredible, robust morphology and amazing teeth to chew their way through life and solve any problem by chewing on it. And early Homo, particularly Homo erectus or Homo ergaster, these early guys, he called thinking machines, that they weren't built to chew, they were built to think their way out of problems, which raises an interesting question of what it was they were chewing. But they clearly had a larger brain. They were associated with a range of different kinds of stone tools. And so most anthropologists became convinced that early Homo was a tool maker. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, tools are often associated with animal bones. So the whole, it just fit perfectly. But we've learned a lot more since then, and I'm now about to make everything much fuzzier, more ambiguous and complex. But first, before we do that, if you think about big brains, they can be a good thing. They can allow you to think your way through problems and solve problems as a thinking machine. But big brains are expensive, and it turns out that if you have a large brain like a human, you need a lot more energy to support that large brain than if you have an ape-sized brain like a chimpanzee. And in fact, these examples of our own lineage, early Homo, they really had the first larger than ape-sized brains, which suggests that they had the first increased metabolic demands because of this increased brain size. And if you look at all the Australopithecines, some of their bodies were a little bit larger and their brains are a little bit larger than chimps today, but not much. They're basically sort of a roughly ape-sized brain. But if you look at early Homo, their brains were significantly larger, suggesting they had significantly greater metabolic demands. They had to feed their brain. So feed it with what? What was food for thought? And what I wanted to introduce you to this evening is some of the key hypotheses that are put forward to try and explain how our ancestors were able to afford a big brain. And there have been a variety of hypotheses. One suggestion is, well, meat. They're omnivores, and meat can be a high protein food. If you get fatty meat, it has a lot of calories attached to it. That's one hypothesis. Another hypothesis is tubers. And we'll talk a little bit more about roots this evening, but it turns out that roots are a fairly valuable commodity. We're used to potatoes, which are very starchy. We've domesticated roots. Wild roots in Africa are a lot more fibrous and harder to chew than any kind of the domestic potatoes we know about. And yet they contain a lot of carbohydrate, so they're potentially a great food resource. And there aren't that many wild animals that can get access to really deeply buried roots like tubers. There are pigs. There are little mole rats and things that dig up very shallow stuff, but digging down to get really tubers, it's this unused resource that potentially, if our ancestors could have gotten access to tubers, perfect. They would have just had a bonanza. Another theory we'll talk about is the idea that perhaps it was cooking. Cooking allowed us to process food in a way that increased its nutritional value and could support a big brain. Or perhaps brains we could afford, our ancestors could afford large brains because of our innate flexibility and the kind of dependable nature of our diet. Those are all possibilities we'll look at. Cooking comes in many guises. We'll think about that. Well, what about these poor guys, the poor Australopithecines or robust paranthropines, if you will? What were they chewing? Maybe they were chewing tubers. Surely those big teeth were useful for something. Or one of the early hypotheses was that those massive large teeth would have been perfectly designed for chewing small, hard foods, things like seeds or something else like that. And maybe these guys were just, crunching seeds. Or maybe they were eating something that we're not familiar with. If you think about it, all these creatures we're talking about this evening are now extinct. We have no living models for what they were eating. So trying to figure this out, it's a fun puzzle. And it's a puzzle that we now have extraordinary new evidence to try and answer. We've come a long way since the 1960s and early 70s, certainly come a long way since the 1920s and the original, Robinson's original dietary hypothesis. And what I want to do this evening is just to give you a couple samples of some of these amazing kinds of new evidence that we're getting that can inform us as we're trying to figure out what these guys ate. And I should say, I think almost everybody, all these different types of studies that we're going to talk about, I think they've almost all been funded in all or in part by the Leakey Foundation. So it's sort of in honor of the Leakey Foundation, we're going to talk about science this evening and scientific evidence of. But before we get going, I just wanted to make one little point, and that's that there are two fundamental types of evidence we're going to look at. There's the evidence from the cranial morphology and the skeletal morphology, the fossils that everybody loves. Those are evidence of inherited adaptations, what these creatures inherited from mom and dad and their ancestors. That can tell you a lot about what they were in a sense, what their lineage had become adapted for. But there are all sorts of other kinds of evidence which we can now turn to that can tell us not what these ancient creatures were adapted for, but how they actually lived, what their own life experiences were like, whether it was their own life history as preserved in their fossils or remains of the artifacts they made, the foods, their living sites, or the kinds of environments and habitats where they've been found. So we'll be looking at examples of both of those, but they tell us different kinds of things. So first, let's enhance our understanding a little bit of the not only we've started with heads. Let's finish with heads, but do it not only by looking at the morphology of these ancient skulls, but also probing a little bit deeper and finding out what we can learn about the individual animals' lives while they were alive, not just what they look like when they died. So there are bunches of different kinds of new approaches to understanding the cranial morphology. We can do amazing things with computers now. I say we euphemistically because I can't do this, but our colleagues have been able to thoroughly try and do experimental work and thoroughly investigate the mechanical properties of the shape of skulls, what we call biomechanics. And they've been able to follow through on some of the original suggestions that the sort of shape and size of the crania of these different fossils was adapted to withstand the stresses and strains of chewing. Your masseter muscle pulls on your cheekbones, and so if you have a big masseter muscle and a wimpy cheekbone, you're going to break the bones on your cheek. It just doesn't work. And what you can see here are these are the highlighted areas in red suggest where the bones were built to withstand the strain of strong muscles in pulling mode, and the blue areas down below show where the bone is built up to withstand compressionary forces. So you're both pulling and pushing on your bones every time you take a bite of something. Now our diets are a lot softer than anything these guys are eating, but there's clear evidence from the bones that they were really chewing things, and not only in their cheek teeth, but the authors of this study, Straight, and some of his colleagues have argued that, well, they were probably biting into tough fruits and things as well, that it looks like they were putting stress on the fronts of their mouths. So there's enhanced that way. But some of the most fascinating discoveries, I think, that have come out in the last few years have been microscopic studies of the wear on the teeth of these fossils, led by Peter Unger and Fred Grein and Mark Tieford and a number of their colleagues. They've gone in and started looking not just at species in general, but at different individuals of these representative species to try and sort out what was the texture of their foods like, because that's what's preserved on the surface of your teeth. And initially, when they started these studies, it was all fairly simple. Even I could understand it. If you ate really hard objects, you tended to leave little tiny microscopic pits on the surface of the enamel of your teeth. And if you were eating sort of fibrous foods or foods that had a lot of tiny like silica particles, if you were eating grass blades, for example, or stripping bamboo, those tiny little silica particles left striations on the surface of your teeth or scratches. And so when they first started studying dental microwear, they looked at the ratio of pits to scratches as sort of a rough indicator of, well, what was the texture of the foods of these ancient hominids likely to be. And I still find this the easiest way to sort of understand this, but as we'll discover in a second, it's gotten much more complex. So, but you can look at the proportion of pits to striations here. So the higher up on this graph you get, the pittier your teeth are, or pithier, I suppose. All of these studies of fossils are done by comparison, not just with each other, but with by comparison to the anatomy of living creatures. And so you start out any study like this, if you're doing microwear analysis, the first thing you want to do is look at, well, how do the teeth of living chimpanzees look, for example? Well, it turns out that chimps eat a lot of soft foods. They're right there in the middle. You can see them. And they prefer to eat fruit. Sometimes they'll eat herbaceous vegetation, as Richard Wrangham on the video was talking about a little bit. They'll eat meat, but meat's pretty soft too. And so if you look at the surface of chimp teeth, they're quite finely polished. They don't have any of these big, or very few of these big, deep pits, compared to some of the mangabey or the little cebus monkey on the far left of the graph. They eat a lot of seeds. The little cebus monkeys, my goodness, they crack open nuts, and that affects the kind of wear on their teeth. And so they have very pitted teeth. Things like the mountain gorillas on the far right eat soft vegetation, but it's very tough. It has a lot of silica particles in it, and so their teeth are heavily striated. So you get this sort of range. Well, where do the fossils fall in all of this? We've got some Australopithecines. You've got the gracile and robust Australopithecine from South Africa there, and sure enough, their dental wear fit the model of the earlier, more gracile Australopithecine in the middle there. Looks like it had the texture of its diet was sort of chimp-like, whereas the more robust character on the left clearly was eating harder foods, more brittle foods, maybe foods like orangutans eat today, where they like to get soft fruit, but a lot of times they have to eat bark and some tough seeds. So that actually fit the sort of morphology of these guys. What about early Homo? Well, here things start to get a little more complicated because you've got Homo habilis sitting right there, right next to the early Australopithecine, clearly eating food somewhere between the texture of a chimp and an orangutan. But then way over here on the left, with an incredible number of pits on its little teeth, are individual Homo erectus samples. If you look at the teeth under a microscope, it looks like you've taken a tiny little sledgehammer and banged them. So what in the world were they eating? Something, perhaps very gritty. It didn't fit the model. They're up there with the robust Australopithecines, and then over on the right you've got Homo habilis and the little Australopithecus africanus, and then, last but not least, way over on the right you've got Zinj. With these massive chewing muscles and heavy architecture. Everybody was predicting that Zinj should have had a tooth wear that looked a lot like the other robust Australopithecine, but no, it's way down on the soft chimp end of things, just based on this sort of stuff. So this really intrigued folks, and Unger and his colleagues started doing more complex analyses of the surfaces of these teeth, and it gets very fancy. And what they try to do is basically they use what amounts to a geographic information system to measure in detail the surfaces of these teeth. So they're not just counting pits and scratches; they're actually looking at the detailed topography of these teeth. And by doing this, they've gotten a very precise approach to studying tooth wear in particular facets and everything else. One of the things they've been able to do, is look at the comparison between the sort of topographic complexity of the teeth, which you see on the bottom graph compared to the sort of linearity or the alignment of the striations, which is called anisotropy on the left. And so if you have a tooth that all the scratches are really aligned, you're higher on the left axis, and if you have no alignment, very isotropic scratch marks, you're down on the bottom. And so if you look at where food should fall, if you're eating a fibrous, tough, sort of gorilla-like diet, you should be up there on a high anisotropic values. And if you're eating a lot of hard, brittle seeds and things like that, you should be have very complex surface. So it's a fancy way of measuring pits and scratches, basically. All right, what are the results? Well, if you look at mangabees, seed eaters, they fall in there. If you look at capuchin monkeys, the little cebus monkeys, they sort of fall also in that range. So they're eating a lot of hard foods, and some of them are eating incredibly hard foods, brittle foods up there. And so you get a really wide range when you're looking at the little monkeys. What about our hominids? Well, Australopithecines are falling, the gracile, the early Australopithecines are falling on the left-hand side, seen there in yellow. So very low complexity in their surfaces, and yet some sort of fibrousness kicking there, so that's kind of fun. The robust Australopithecines are eating foods that are creating more complexity in the surface of their teeth. They're getting a lot more pits, and very little fibrousness, as it turns out, at least for those South African robust. But you look at Boise eyes, and in other words, Zinj, and he's way over on the left. And each of these dots represents a different individual fossil. So what you're starting to see is the variability between individuals. And of course, it's important to remember that the surface scratches on your teeth just represent the scratches in the last few weeks before you died. And so part of what we're looking at is the range of variability within individuals during their lifetimes, undoubtedly. So you have to get that. But Zinj, very different. The Zinj in red compared to the robust Australopithecines in orange, almost no overlap at all. So when Peter Unger looked at these results, and he looked at Zinj, he said, it looks more like they were eating Jell-O. There's just, it's something didn't fit. Here you have this incredible robust morphology, and their teeth are none the worse for wear. They're sort of smoothly polished. It looks like they're eating a lot of fruit. So it's crazy, and it creates something that biologists have called Liam's paradox, where perhaps you have an animal that inherited this physicality to chew its way through problems, but perhaps during large portions of its life, it didn't actually have to chew its way through problems, and it could eat as much soft food as it wanted to. But perhaps what we're seeing is the morphology of creatures that they're built to get through really tough times, to be able to chew up famine foods when push came to shove, perhaps. And so this is a problem that anthropologists have been focusing on a little bit. There are many kinds of roots. Everybody's looked at roots. There are lots of different kinds of edible roots that are available, and the competition is low. These are just some pictures, very tiny little, these are sedges, here's some bulbs. East African roots, look, these are wild roots. They look not unlike wild roots in North America as well, but there they go. Here I am in a swamp. It turns out you can eat the roots of cattails if you're ever really hungry, and you can get down there, and some what are called woody rootstocks of small shrubs. People get water out of these today, but there's really not much carbohydrate in a root like this. It's something. It's really a starvation food, and of course they're living foragers who live off of roots. Here's some pictures of the Hadza in Tanzania, digging whopping big holes to get lots of potatoes, and you have to be able to dig quite deep to get some of these things. Here she is walking back home carrying what look like sticks, but in fact those are tubers. And when the Hadza chew their tubers, a lot of times they'll chew and then spit out the quid, and having sort of extracted all the good juice from it, and they're spitting out the fiber. And there's a bit of a debate between some of my colleagues, Kristen Hawkes and Margaret Schoeninger, about the nutritional quality of some of these wild roots, that they are so fibrous that, so say you could eat 100 pounds of wild roots, well, how much nutrition would you actually be getting out of these? So that's going on. So the Hadza eat a lot of their roots raw, cold, but occasionally they will roast them, and often just for a few seconds in the fire, but sometimes for a little bit longer. And an interesting question is, well, does this affect the nutritional properties of the roots? And it turns out it affects not only a little bit of the nutritional property, it also softens them up a bit. And Peter Lucas has gone in with a fancy little machine up there on the top left, and you can actually measure the amount of force that it takes to crush different roots. And so they've done a lot of fancy metrics, and have basically concluded, you can sort of see a little bit on the bottom right, that in fact some tubers, even if only cooked for a brief amount of time, it softens them up considerably. So it makes them more palatable. And for some of the tubers, if they roast them, as you can see this one on the left, if you can cook it for maybe as many as 10 minutes, it actually makes the starch more digestible. It starts to break down the starch. So cooking can have an effect for living people. We know the Hadza cook today. An interesting question is, could any of our ancestors from this really remote period in time, did they cook? This is Richard Wrangham. You probably are quite familiar with his work studying chimpanzees. He's also come up with a challenge for archaeologists that he said, well, surely one of the things that might explain the morphology of early Homo, the larger brain eating concentrated sort of rich food resources, and yet how do you get those resources with tiny teeth? How can you explain the sort of wimpy chewing ability of these guys? Maybe they'd figured out how to cook. That would not only soften the fiber and alleviate the need to chew these things, but it might make the starch in these wild roots more accessible to digestion. The problem with this, of course, is that you might argue it's sort of a half-baked idea, because if you're looking for evidence of fire from these early sort of any of the sites where Australopithecines or early Homo have been found, it's hard to come by. And the question of when our ancestors first controlled the use of fire is a really key question. Here's just one of the sites which may have some evidence for early fire. This is 1.5 million years old, a site from Near East Turkana. And it's a site where you can't actually see it, but this is a place. Each of those little bumps down there this is an archaeological site with a bunch of stone tools and broken up animal bones. And smack dab in the middle of it all, there was a discolored patch. Geological tests were done, and sure enough, this is a patch of soil that was burnt in antiquity. So cool, we have ancient fire, but did it have anything to do with the stones or bones that were associated with it? Maybe it was just somehow left over from a wildfire, because you have wildfires burning all the time. You know these very well in the American Southwest. These things can rocket through, and if you haven't had a burn in a while, they can do a lot of damage. Most of the fires in East Africa today, the natural fires, move quite quickly, and like you see on the left, and they just sort of scorch the grass, but they actually don't burn very much. And this is a wild asparagus where the shoots are coming up within a week after the burn happened. And so it doesn't necessarily destroy the earth, and a fire that's moving that quickly doesn't heat the earth up very much either, whereas our campfires really smolder and heat things up for a while. It looks like these early burnt patches were heated to quite a high temperature. And the only way you can think about that occurring naturally is if you have a case like over on the right, where that's the remains of a big trunk of a tree that smoldered and smoldered and smoldered. It's a wild tree. And finally left behind this patch of ash and burnt earth, that it really cooked the earth. And what we have at sites like that site at Turkana is patches of cooked Earth. Now, was there food? Was that done deliberately? Perhaps they're just things like this, but they're finding more and more of these. My colleague Jack Harris on working in the Turkana project has been systematically, he and his students have systematically been trying to map these sorts of things. So perhaps in East Africa, 1.5 million years ago, it's contemporary with early Homo erectus. Certainly a little bit later on in sites in South Africa, you have evidence from caves at Swartkrans where you not only have stone tool artifacts and smashed bones, but bones that have actually been burnt. And these are in situations in caves where it's hard to imagine any sort of natural way that you could get the sort of burnt bones. So, maybe by a million years, maybe 1.5 million years, but we still don't have any evidence of cooking. And so Rangan's challenge remains. What about tubers and other things? What else, could they have been a viable food? What else can we learn? And it turns out that you can study, you can actually grind up bones. And it turns out that we are what we eat in ways that Briand-Savarin never really imagined. And this is a picture of Matt Sponheimer, who's done some incredible work on what we call bone chemistry. And this is a sort of basically, there's an interesting principle that our bones, the chemistry of our bones comes to reflect the chemistry of the foods we put in our mouths. And one example of this is carbon. Of course, bodies are made up of a lot of carbon. The carbon originally comes from the atmosphere. Plants fix carbon through photosynthesis. And one of the interesting things about carbon is it comes in isotopes of different weights. And it turns out they're different kinds of plants with photosynthetic pathways. Here in the Southwest, you've got a lot of succulents and plants that are adapted to really hot, dry environments, what we call tropical grasses. They actually have a slightly different photosynthetic pathway than trees and shrubs in temperate environments, where I am in Indiana, for example. And it turns out that those different types of plants photosynthesize. When they're photosynthesizing, they're fixing carbon, the isotopes of carbon, in slightly different proportions. What are called the C3 plants, or the things like trees and herbs, they actually discriminate against some of the heavy stable carbon isotopes. And so chemically, the carbohydrates that are produced by grasses and succulents are chemically different than the carbohydrates that are produced by trees and herbs. So most of the fruits and tubers look chemically really different than bulbs and sedges or grass blades and things like that. So this is useful to us because the chemistry of the plants then is in effect translated into the physiology of the tissues of the things that eat the plants. There's a bit of what's called a fractionation, so a bias. But basically, if you eat a lot of fruits or anything off of trees or most herbs, or if you're like one of these little browsing antelopes and you're eating leaves, the chemical signature of your bones in terms of the stable carbon looks really different than if you're a grazer like that zebra and you're eating the C4 plants that have the heavier carbon isotopes in them. So you can distinguish the bones of browsing and grazing antelopes and different sorts of ungulates by looking at their chemistry. Turns out termites are somewhere in between, which is kind of fun. And the predators that eat those animals, their chemical signature falls out. So if you're eating a lot of browsers, your bones have a chemical signature that really resembles browsers. If you're eating a lot of grazers, your bone chemistry resembles grazer tissue. So this is a great clue when we can go back and test ancient bones. It gives us the possibility of figuring out, well, what was the mix of diet between plants and animals that fall within these different sort of photosynthetic regimes. So to cut to the chase, if you look at something like a baboon, its chemistry, stable isotope chemistry, falls sort of within that range of what we call between -10 and 15 parts per million in terms of that ratio. Hyenas, which eat a lot of browsing as well as grazing animals, their bone chemistry is in between. And grazers, things like that warthog over on the right that eats a lot of grasses and grass shoots, have a much more positive chemistry. Well, where do our Australopithecines fall? Here's the gracile Australopithecus that Dart and Broom were describing. It turns out that chemically, it looks like they're getting a lot of these C4 kinds of foods, or at least they're getting a mix. They're not eating pure sort of fruits and things from trees and shrubs. And darn if those robust Australopithecines, the ones that were supposed to be eating such different kinds of foods, chemically, they look pretty much the same, maybe slightly less C4 food. And when they first started doing this study, they got very excited because it's hard to imagine the amount of C4 foods that would create this kind of signature. Either they were eating a lot of meat of grazing animals, or they must have been eating a lot of these little sedges or bulbs or grass. And there's no evidence that any of these guys were chewing on grass seeds. It just doesn't look like that. So trying to figure out what their diet actually was, it's sort of you triangulate between the wear on the teeth and the chemistry of their bones and whatnot. But so it's sort of ambiguous. The other interesting thing about bone chemistry is you can actually, back to that original picture of the tooth. This is where Matt Sponheimer and his team have been sampling these individual growth layers in the teeth. That as we develop as children, our teeth grow incrementally. And what he's been able to do is actually sample each or little clusters of these sort of incremental layers of the tooth growth, sample them independently. And so what he's been able to do is sample the chemical signature of an individual's tooth at different points during its lifetime. And so if you follow one of these lines, the black dots are particularly noticeable. What he's doing is getting the chemical signature of individual growth increment of a teeth, and originally that individual starts out with very, very positive, a really high C4. They're eating grass or something that eats grass way up there, and then during the course of what each dot represents about a week or a couple weeks worth of time, during the course of what's probably several months, that individual's diet shifts chemically. And this is, they've done studies of other animals preserved in the same sediments, like this little browsing antelope, that show quite a bit of stability. So it's not an artifact of the preservation process. Something's going on in the lives of these individuals, as you would expect in a seasonal environment, where you might be tempted to eat different things at different times of the year. So this makes a lot of sense, and what it shows us is that as we come to understand the diets of individuals during their lifetimes, we're going to get many more clues to get a lot closer to understanding what's going on. Were these guys getting meat with their potatoes? I mean, there's some archaeological evidence, like these little tools from Swartkrans, that suggest they were digging something, either termites or maybe they were digging up roots. But were they getting any meat with that? The evidence for meat doesn't come from the teeth, because it doesn't really leave tooth wear. The evidence for meat comes from archaeological sites, and you're probably all familiar with the world's oldest stone tools, are about 2.5 million years old. And they're associated with, they're basically simple cutting and pounding tools. And they're often associated at these sites with the remains of animals that have been either smashed open for marrow, the long marrow bones, or sometimes they've been cut with stone tools. And so this has produced this notion of meat eating in human evolution. And yet these are archaeological sites. And yet the archaeological sites don't preserve any plant foods. They rot away. And so we're left from the archaeology wondering what the plant foods could have been. And we know they must have eaten plant foods because primates eat plant foods and we're descended from primates. And there are lots of plant foods in the East African landscape. I spent a number of years collecting plant foods in the East African landscape. So they're there. So trying to sort out the kinds of foods that would have been palatable and available to hominids over the course of a year that might have been chewable. Here you have honey, which is a kind of a processed plant food, if you will. One of these things that so much of our archaeology suggests we had this reliance on tools and meats, and yet there's a whole part of the diet of these guys that just isn't preserved archaeologically, and we sort of have to turn to the fossils to look at. The other thing, and it's wonderful to see bits of Jane Goodall on the film beforehand, because her leadership has led to a new generation of studies among primatologists that really can give us a much broader context for interpreting the early archaeological evidence as well as the paleontological evidence from understanding of primate behavior today. And if you look at the balance in living chimps, they love many populations. They love to hunt. They love the taste of meat, and they try to get as much meat as they can. You could argue that it has more social valence than it has nutritional importance. And they, of course, rely on plant foods. And then recently, the wonderful work at the Fongoli site, where it's one of those little refrigerator magnets as you were coming in, the Leakey Foundation, sort of celebrating the fact that we now have evidence of chimps actually using tools to hunt little bush babies in these dry areas in West Africa. Wonderful new evidence from dry areas in East Africa, in Tanzania, not far from Gombe, a little site called Ugala, where they've recently found evidence for chimpanzees digging fairly shallow holes with different kinds of sticks, digging up little roots and things. So, we're not the only creatures that go for meat and potatoes. It looks like chimps from time to time will as well. And it's also a good reminder to remember that if you remember the chimps in West Africa, crack open nuts with stone tools. And yet, and if you look at the stone tools they use, some of them are used over and over and over again. Like this one on the right actually has that's a big hunk of solid rock, and yet it has a worn dimple from hammering with it, which really resembles some of the dimpled stones that Mary Leakey originally described from Olduvai. So we may actually have some artifacts that might have been used to process plant foods. There are lots of nuts and things that would have been available to crack, but it's worth remembering that, so you have these wonderful sites where chimps return again and again, season after season, to crack nuts, and recently they've actually done some excavations that have determined that some of these sites go back thousands and thousands of years, 4,000 years in the case of the Nulu site. And yet, what's preserved at the site? Just a bunch of little broken rocks. There would be the sort of fragments of the hammerstones that were being used to break nuts at the site. So there's no evidence from this site of the vast repertoire of the foods that the chimps were eating there. And it's a useful reminder to us that the early archaeological sites wouldn't necessarily preserve anything like that as well. So it's a challenge. So the archaeologists are getting challenged from left and right. The primatologists keep saying, well, were they cooking? Were they eating vegetable foods? Go out and find us some evidence. And it's really an interesting challenge. If you're trying to think about how you make a living in tough times, Glenn Isaac had originally suggested that it wasn't the types of foods you got, it's the strategies you used to acquire those foods. And he argued that the quintessential human trait of food sharing may be a type of behavior that we can trace way back in time. Something that is the sort of fundamental foundation of our humanity. Perhaps that these early sites with evidence of both tool raw materials and animal foods being brought in from multiple locations, perhaps those are sites where food sharing took place, where things coming in, sites that look a lot like what human campsites look like today. And there's a hint in the fossil record that perhaps if you look at the skeleton, this marvelous skeleton of early Homo erectus or ergaster that was recently found, the suggestion is that the brains of early Homo were so large, and for this particular individual at least, his hips were so thin, it would have been really hard to give birth to an infant that wasn't premature by ape standards. And so if that is true, and we're slowly getting a better understanding of hip width in Homo erectus, and perhaps this poor guy is a fluke. But if that's true, that suggests that there might have been some periods of infant dependency, which would have meant there would have been a big selective advantage for the safety and provisioning of having food sharing at a campsite, and an enhanced sort of spatial focus to the landscape, that would have made it easier for these early Homo, no matter how much meat and potatoes they were eating, would have been a little bit easier. And one of my colleagues, Leslie Aiello, famously argued what she called the expensive tissue hypothesis, that the only way to support a big brain is to have the incredible shrinking gut, that the energy that we invest in our brain means that we don't have enough energy to have these big capacious guts that all our ape relatives have. And yet it looks like the Australopithecines had big capacious guts too. So there have been some profound shifts that we can get evidence for in both the broader physiology preserved from the skeleton as well as the archaeological and evidence. Ultimately, I think when it comes down to, if you think about a plant food perspective, and I tend to do that, it comes down to what I like to think of as a crunch period. When your plant food options are limited, you can try to maximize your preferred foods, get great search strategies for the best patches. You can try and cope with the worst foods, and you can do that with either through physical adaptations or tool use or cooperative strategies, or you can try and find alternatives, things like insects and honey, or maybe even scavenging. And it looks like these guys probably did a little bit of that. In the last few years, because I've been doing administration, I've been doing some armchair archaeology, and have been trying to model how well early hominids might have been able to subsist on different kinds of plant foods. And so we've simulated ancient landscapes and dropped little computer agents onto those landscapes to see how well they could survive given different requirements, nutritional requirements and motion requirements. And we build these landscapes based on realistic plant food data. And even with very simple little computer models, you can generate quite distinctive patterns of ranging land use. And these little guys can survive eating tubers or eating meat, as here represented on the left with red spots, tubers or brown spots. And so we're starting to develop these little computer models to enhance our ability to interpret the kind of direct empirical ancient evidence that we find. And ultimately, I think if you think about the kinds of information we have, ultimately we have to go back to, models are fun, but now I'm going to get back to the field, I hope, and help my colleagues find some new empirical evidence, because that's ultimately how we test our ideas, by finding new evidence. And I think it's somebody like Darwin would be pleased that we can focus on the kind of variation between individuals now in the fossil record, because ultimately it's that kind of variability and the variation and the selective advantages of individuals' lives that, in fact, makes evolution happen. It's one of the key sort of drivers of evolutionary change is in fact variation. And so if you think about the kinds of evidence we have available now, the kinds of amazing clues we're getting to the diets of individuals, I think even though I can't stand here today and say we ate 20% meat and 30% salads and have less fiber in your diet, I think it bodes really well for the next few years, and the discoveries are going to be fun and fascinating to look for. So thank you, Leakey Foundation, and thank all of you.